This is Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Was President Trump right to order the drone strike on Iran's top general? That's a national policy question, a question of prudence. Here's a more important question from a Christian perspective. Was the drone strike just? Can any act of war be just? Today on the BreakPoint Podcast, John Stonestreet welcomes Dr. J. Daryl Charles, an expert on the Christian just war tradition. What conditions must be met before going to war? And what conditions must be met in conducting a war? Is pacifism a defensible Christian position? For this and more, here are John Stonestreet and J. Daryl Charles.
Well, there are some theological conversations that become contemporarily relevant again, whether you like it or not. And we're going to talk about one of those today on the BreakPoint Podcast. Thanks for joining us. And I'm pleased to welcome, I was going to say Daryl, an old friend, but don't take that as an age joke. What I meant is we go back at least 11 or 12 years to working together. Bryan College at one point and have since both moved on, but my guest is Dr. Daryl Charles. He's an affiliate scholar with the Acton Institute in specifically dealing with theology and ethics. He is a prolific author specifically on a topic that a lot of folks don't want to dip their toe into because it's complicated and there's a long history of it, and it's especially complicated when you try to apply it. And that's the idea of just war theory. So if you joined us on Monday on the podcast, my guest was Mindy Belch from World Magazine. She was walking us through this decision by the president to take out General Soleimani from Iran. And of course, we're recording this about a week from where it's going to air. So it's extremely difficult when things are so fragile and tedious to know what's developed since then. But regardless, I wanted to have a conversation with Daryl Charles about the idea of just war theory because it's one of those things, one of those categories of thought that helps Christians deal with contemporary issues. And this is unfortunately relevant again. So Daryl Charles, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be with you.
So just war theory is an attempt of Christians historically to kind of pull together kind of Christian ethics in the context of the challenges of the real world. And these are difficult waters. Where did your interest, Daryl, in just war theory come from?
Wow, how much time do you have for my answer? To begin with, though, I think I need to offer a bit of a caveat. I grew up, believe it or not, in an Anabaptist tradition. That is to say, among card-carrying pacifists. My dad was a conscientious objector during World War II, and I hadn't really thought about the issues of war and peace seriously until I became a Christian in my early 20s. So I went through something of a transformation in my own thought life. But I grew up in an area where there are a lot of Mennonites, Brethren, Church of the Brethren, those sorts of people who come out of the radical Reformation tradition. But however that may have been, I ended up doing criminal justice research with a certain fellow by the name of Charles Colson back in the early
I've heard of that guy. Yeah, that guy sounds familiar. I forgot that that's a part of your story as well. That's fantastic.
That's right, yes. And I had just gotten done with doctoral work, and I was invited to go through a battery of interviews at Prison Fellowship, and I ended up then spending the next several years working under their auspices and helping Mr. Colson, just to develop patterns of policy, think through issues of culture. And it was during that time of doing criminal justice research, John, that I really started thinking much more seriously about issues of justice. Criminal justice, it seems to me, is instructive because we're forced to make moral judgments for the common social good, aren't we?
Yeah.
The police, they have to apply measured force. As a society, we don't tolerate certain human behavior. As a matter of fact, only an uncivilized society would tolerate everything. So criminal justice proceeds under certain assumptions, which we all take for granted. And the idea that somehow justice is possible or civil society is possible without force is simply a myth. I mean, just try not paying your taxes, right? Just try driving 80 in a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. Force will restrict you.
Right. And it should. I mean, that's a key point of it, right? Is that we need that sort of restrictions. Right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, most people will object and say, well, Daryl, wait a minute. It's one thing to speak of police or law enforcement action. It's quite another to speak of a military intervention at the international level. But I would argue that the principles of justice, John, remain the same, whether that's applied domestically or in foreign affairs. That is to say, if justice truly is just, then there's a universal character to it that all people, all nations, all human beings can intuit. And our common morality then makes it possible to work in a relative sense toward justice. I'm not speaking of justice in a perfect manner, but on this side of the eschaton, we work for justice, but we do it in a relative or imperfect way. Now, I can see, and I can hear another objection coming down the pike. Well, Daryl, look at all the injustice that's done by the criminal justice system, or look at all the injustice that's done in terms of the history of war and military intervention. And, one can raise that objection quite sincerely. The Yale historian Harry Stout has guessed that we, in our young history, John, have entered about 300 military interventions or wars just in our short history. That's staggering. So it seems to me, of all people and of all nations, we need to be thinking seriously about justice in terms of how it applies, not just domestically, but internationally. And I would say there's another reason, too, that we're forced to think in those terms. To whom much has been given, much is required. And that's not right, wrong, good, or bad. That's simply a reality. And those nations, such as the states, who have or which have certain responsibilities in the world, their responsibilities are greater. And for that reason, then, it's incumbent upon us to think, reflect long and hard on what just or unjust intervention might look like as we consider foreign affairs in our day.
Now, as we apply it, of course, it gets really muddy, and I want folks to know that you've written a couple books on this, The Just War Tradition, first of all, and then America and the Just War Tradition, which after the weekend, you might have to add another chapter here, given what we're looking at. But Daryl, let's go back to the idea of just war, and you've explained kind of its roots and kind of the reality of trying to live ethically in the world and hold together the stewardship of a nation like ours, the necessity of protecting citizens and so on. Give us a little bit of the history of those thinkers that most directly and strongly contributed to the just war tradition.
Sure. That's very important to think through historically what the tradition entails. And I'm going to go back to the word you used earlier. You spoke of just war theory. That is typical in discussions of ethics of war and peace. I would prefer to speak in terms of the just war thinking as a tradition rather than as a theory. Theories come and go. Theories are malleable. Theory can be relativized. But a tradition is something that is enduring, is it not? There's something abiding to the tradition. I would often compare tradition to the flow of a river. You have, yes, tributaries, you have lakes, you have inlets, you have local embodiments of that river that take on their own character, and yet there is one main stream, is there not? And in the same way, the just war tradition is in fact that something that's enduring. It doesn't change, and from age to age, it's united by various thinkers and by moral principles that are abiding. Now, yes, the application of that, and John, you insinuated that a minute ago, the application of those principles will always look different, won't it? It will require fresh reflection on the contemporary geopolitics of the matter. But if we don't have those abiding principles rooted in that tradition, then we're basically left to flow down the river rootless, anchorless, without anything to guide us whatsoever. Names of people who may or may not be familiar to our listeners and our readers would be church fathers such as Ambrose, who was a spiritual father to Augustine. Augustine himself, who had, not in a systematized way, but had important things to say about the justness or unjustness of intervention. People like Gratian and then Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas didn't have much to say, but what he had to say is of enduring value to those of us who wrestle with just war application and principle. And then you have reformers like Luther, who had a surprising amount to say about war and peace in his day, as Europe was being attacked from various sides. You have late modern thinkers such as Francisco de Vitoria and San Francisco Suarez, as well as Hugo Grotius, early 17th century. Grotius, of course, is considered by many to be the father of international law. And then you have down to the present, let's enter the 20th century. You have important thinkers like the Roman Catholic theologian John Courtney Murray in the 50s and 60s, William V. O'Brien, who taught politics at Georgetown in the 70s and 80s, and then Paul Ramsey, a generation removed, who taught at Princeton for about 30 years. And then close to our time, you have James Turner Johnson, just retired from Rutgers University, as well as Jean Beck Elstein, who died about 4 years ago. She was teaching at the University of Chicago.
And Daryl Charles. Let's add your name to that list. I think you've done a lot, Daryl, to really bring this tradition, and I do appreciate that correction. Tradition's a much better word for this, and mainly because it has been shaped by so many different theological streams.
Yes.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. So walk us through the principles. Now, again, these principles are trying to hold together. Tell me if I'm wrong. We're trying to hold together this ethic of, loving our neighbor in light of also an ethic which is, thou shalt not kill, and kind of direct prohibitions against, violent force. So walk us through how we can think through this.
Sure. Well, could I begin just by stating certain assumptions that are part of the tradition before actually identifying the principles, because I think the assumptions help us in understanding the principle themselves. For example, the just war tradition is predicated on the assumption that all people intuit basic right and wrong. Now, that's contested in our pluralistic postmodern cultural environment, is it not? But that's the essence of natural law thinking. Protestants maybe have not been champions of that as much as our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, which is the natural law tradition is a rich part of their theological and philosophical tradition. All people intuit basic right and wrong. That's the argument, is it not, of St. Paul, early Romans 1 and 2, right? What he calls the law written on the heart. Thomas Aquinas said it this way: the essence of the natural law reduces to this: do good and avoid doing wrong. Well, that's the essence, and that's the bottom line for thinking about issues of war and peace. The just war tradition, further in its assumptions, John, is, I guess we could call it a mediating position between two opposite poles of thinking about coercive force. One I mentioned a couple minutes ago, ideological pacifism, which believes that coercive force can never, in any circumstance or situation, be used for moral or just purposes. On the other end of the force spectrum, you would have, let's call it militarism or political realism. And that could be religious or secularly motivated, by the way. But the assumption being force never needs to be morally qualified. Well, the just war position is between those two opposites, mediating, arguing that force must be severely qualified. It must be. Sometimes it's justified. Sometimes it may not be. And then further assumed, and I want to make this distinction, war and peace are, shall we say, two discontinuous or incommensurable realms or universes with different rules. Rather, they belong to the same unity. Peace always has to be justly ordered. Aquinas described it this way: peace is the fruit of justice. I like that.
Yeah.
So our goal is not peace, but it's a justly ordered peace. And if we don't have a justly ordered peace, John, then the goods of human flourishing can't be protected or guarded. And another distinction I'd like to make is this: a difference, morally speaking, between violence and force. Now, that might seem like gnat-straining to some of our listeners. Violence, I'm going to define as that application of force which undermines law and politics and society, whereas force we may define as that application which will undergird and protect law, politics, and society, if that makes sense. And then I guess a final assumption I want to make is that justice and charity, John, must not be severed. justice is leavened by charity. I heard you refer to the golden rule a minute ago, didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
So we can apply coercive force because of love, because of charity. That's the golden rule. Do to others as you would want done to you. But the negative corollary is what? Do not do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. And there's a second negative corollary. Don't allow to be done to others, to other individuals, to other people groups, what you wouldn't want done to you. So there you, in a sense, you sense what just cause, right intention, or application of the golden rule means when we're looking at matters of intervention and policy. Now, to your question about the principles, historically, in the tradition, there have been two main families of moral criteria: justice in going to war, the Latin term being jus ad bellum, dust off your high school Latin if you want to, and then justice in conducting war, jus in bello. So ad bellum, whether or not to intervene; in bello, how do we proceed? Historically, there have been three interlocking moral criteria that belong to that family of justice ad bellum. What are they? Just cause, legitimate authority, and right intention. And those are interlocking. They can't be separated.
Before you move on, talk a little
ahead.
bit about that right intention, because that's one that's very, very hard to apply because you're talking about the difference between someone's stated intentions and their real intentions, right?
Exactly. Right. Great question. Well, and the criterion of right intention is often misunderstood for the reasons you stated and more. But in terms of reasoned evidence, patterns of behavior, patterns of policy, we can discern, seems to me, nations can discern in other nations what patterns of evidence yield. Right intention is not some psychological realm, right, whereby we have to intuit what's going on internally. No, rather, right intention is demonstrated by our actions and therefore by our policy, and therefore in the world and foreign affairs by a pattern of evidence. The same is true of criminal justice on the domestic level, right? We observe that. Policemen don't stop people and try to intuit what's going on in their psyche. No, they're interdicting them or they're restricting them on the basis of action taken. So it seems to me, and I want to say about right intention, since you asked, right intention suggests that there must be a proper motivation in intervention. And the golden rule, it seems to me, and one doesn't have to be a religious person to affirm golden rule of ethics. No one, John, in the world, regardless of where he or she lives, regardless of what cultural or social context out of which he or she comes, no one in the world does not believe in the golden rule. Everyone wants others to treat them as they would want to be treated. And no one would deny the fact that we shouldn't do to others what we ourselves wouldn't do. That's true at the individual level, and it's true at the corporate, collective, national, and international level. So it seems to me, through instrumentality and what reasonable evidence produces, we can establish policy and then therefore act as a nation based on that pattern of evidence.
So we're talking here with Daryl Charles about the idea of the just war tradition and how these principles kind of help us think through the conflicts that our world presents us with. And, of course, we are just coming out of a weekend where another one is at least imminent. And, of course, as this airs, who knows what's taken place between that initial event and where we're at today. So we've talked about kind of the justification of making the choice to engage in conflict, having to do with intent, having to do with justifiable cause, and so on. The other side of the coin is how then force is employed. Talk us through that side of the tradition.
Yes, an important question, and probably few areas need further and renewed clarification than this idea of justice in bello, that is, how to proceed. Historically, John, two main criteria have constituted jus in bello, and those families of criteria have to do with discrimination, or some people maybe are more familiar with the descriptor non-combatant immunity. That is to say, there is a presumption of distinguishing between innocence and guilt, right? including civilian populations or wounded soldiers, prisoners, non-combatant women, children, non-combatant males, who may not be held guilty as, say, a government or standing military or representative of those military and government entities might be. A justified war is one according to the tradition that's waged against those who deserve it. So we're not only intuiting, we're making moral discrimination between relative, not absolute, but relative guilt and relative innocence. So discrimination or non-combatant immunity will make that necessary discrimination, which is a relative. It's a relative discrimination, isn't it? No individual, no nation, no coalition of nations would be capable of perfect distinction between combatant and non-combatant. So it's a relative distinction nonetheless. And then the second family of considerations, proportionality. Most people will understand that. We, of course, expect in the domestic context that policemen and law enforcement agents will make their response, their retributive response, proportional to that criminal act which they're seeking to prevent or restrain, right? So there's a direct relationship between the criminal act and the response to that act. That is moral property. So we regulate force there in our response. We do not, let me get back and make a crude illustration. We don't cut off the hands of children who steal cookies, do we? Or teenagers who steal lawnmowers. But neither should we be slapping the back of the hands of people who murder and who rape. So justice is proportional, is it not? And how do most of us react when justice, say in the domestic context, is not proportionate? We have a certain language to describe that, don't we? We cry out, that's a travesty of justice, right? Or that's a miscarriage of justice, which reveals our basic assumption. Somehow deep within, based on the natural law and what has been revealed in the universe, we can discern basic justice from injustice. And so proportionality makes that distinction in response to the criminal or the violating act. It's proportionate to that. And let me back up again and use criminal justice to illustrate here. Policemen and law enforcement agents and agencies, they do not, shall we say, firebomb your neighborhood when a violent criminal perhaps is on the loose, where 500 dwellings exist. They do not go in automatically and firebomb that block just in order to get that sucker, right? Why? Well, that's not a proportionate response. What do? They wait, they gather evidence, they collude, they wait, they share information, but at some point, if violent crime either has erupted or, in their estimation, is about to erupt, then it is immoral not to interdict, not to intercept, not to prevent that from happening. So I would argue that agents of the law are constantly, even when they're unaware of it, they're constantly appropriating and seeking to apply, quote unquote, just war principles such as discrimination and proportionality every day of their work lives, if that makes sense. And the same applies in international affairs too. And I like what Hugo Grotius argued for in The Rights of War and Peace. He said, if justice, John, he didn't say John, he wasn't referring to you. Okay, so I'm
yeah, I don't remember meeting that guy, yeah.
But he argued, if justice is universal, then its principles are the same and applicable, whether in social, domestic, or international context. Because justice, if it's truly universal, is not fluid, but rather is consistent.
Shane Morris here again. For the month of January, we're offering a free subscription to World Magazine in exchange for your donation to the Colson Center. This offer includes 24 print issues as well as full access to digital content from a trusted news source that is grounded in hope and biblical truth. You can give today and receive your subscription at breakpoint.org/January. That's breakpoint.org/January. Now let's get back to John Stonestreet and Dr. J. Daryl Charles.
Well, that is a lot to take in, but it's a helpful framework, and I appreciate your care in explaining it and offering those kind of examples. That some of this stuff is intuitive, but like you said, sometimes we want to apply it in one area and not really see it as universal. I don't know if you knew this, Daryl, but yeah, I mean, I spent my freshman year in college at a Mennonite school, and I didn't have any just war. Yeah, I didn't have any just war, training or anything like that. But there was just the commitment to pacifism didn't seem to pass the muster of the real world. But let me ask you this. I mean, there is a critique too, and I guess this kind of hits at some level an intention from those who would hold on to pacifism that it's impossible to engage in any sort of force like this without really liking it. In other words, that it kind of appeals to our basest nature, and we should avoid anything that tempts us in that way. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, look, it's not as if pacifism as an ideological position contains no truth. Mm-hmm. However, I would argue that on a scale of force in our personal lives, even those of us who are parents and aren't politicians or soldiers or law enforcement agents, those of us who are parents have to wrestle with what is appropriate in the way of application of force as we're molding our children's lives, don't we?
Yeah.
Now, if you're hearing me argue that we use force, that we spank, that we paddle, that we are physically abusive, no, that's not my argument. But I'm simply saying we all apply force at various levels. Even those of us who are perhaps are therapists or psychologists, where do you draw the line? Some people, you might argue, are applying psychological force when they're doing therapy in order to help people freed from the shackles of certain past experiences. Now, let me take a step further out. Even my Mennonite family members and brothers and sisters generally will not deny that force is legitimate by government to force us to pay our taxes. And if we don't, we're forced to go in jail, right? And I would guess that even most Anabaptists, most pacifists would concede that police and law enforcement officers and agencies are necessary to protect civil society. Now, they're simply arguing they can't do it as Christians, to which I would respond, okay, hold the phone. Wait a minute. Why then would the church be encased in this isolated subculture? The attitude being projected is, let the Gentiles do it, right? Let the unbelievers mess with the dirty business of keeping and maintaining justice. And I would argue, John, that very attitude, let the Gentiles do it. I'm going to keep my hands clean. That attitude is thoroughly unchristian and thoroughly uncharitable. Now, as to the question, do motivations get mixed? Can motivations, can they become evil in carrying out coercive force? Yes, of course they can. But every day, you and I can experience wrong, even distorted or evil motivations as we go through our day's work. But the business of maintaining justice will require coercive force. And it's interesting, even the beginning of the Mennonites and the Church of Brethren, if we go back to this early 16th century, the early Anabaptist reformers, of course, they're contemporary to Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and Bucer and the other magisterial leaders, right? From the beginning, in the very first major synod, and therefore document by the Anabaptists called the Schleitheim Confession of 1527, made this distinction, the absolute separation by the Christian community from the world. But it's interesting that even the fathers, Michael Sattler, who penned the Schleitheim Confession, the fathers who were putting that document together acknowledged the reality of Romans 13. They acknowledged that God has ordained the sword and that God has ordained magisterial authority for the punishment of evil and the maintenance of peace. However, they made the distinction and said, we, however, cannot be part of that task. Christians cannot serve as rulers, they may not serve as princes, they may not be political figures, and we definitely can't carry the sword. And yet, they assume that somebody else had to do it, and had to do it in a God-ordained way. I would argue, charitably with my pacifist brethren, that's inconsistent. See, that's picking and choosing from the Sermon on the Mount, and a wrong reading of the sermon, I would argue. And they're being very selective rather than being serious about the full weight of evidence from scriptural revelation. If somebody's got to do it, it's not a Christian attitude to say, you go do it, you of no faith, because we don't want to get our hands dirty. And I would say that's not very Christian, it's not very loving and charitable, and it's definitely not just.
Let me ask you one more question,
Sure.
Daryl Charles. That is, applying this sort of criteria to something like what we saw with taking out the decision to take out General Soleimani. It's not necessarily waging war. It's in an arena where war is kind of already happening, although we're obviously 16 years down the road. There's so many details. David French has weighed into it. Other people have weighed into it, whether this is quote-unquote assassination, whether it's justification. Can this same criteria be used, and maybe walk us through how we might apply it, not just to kind of a conflict like World War II, but to a specific action of force like what we saw with this decision to do a drone strike at the Baghdad airport?
Sure. Well, terrorism is not a new phenomenon, John. Yes, it has new manifestations, but it's an old form of, shall we say, non-conventional conflict. I was not there, but I remember reading history books of the Barbary pirates early on in U.S. history. I believe it was President Jefferson had to deal with that menace. So piracy, terrorism has existed for millennia, right? That is to say, asymmetrical or non-conventional means of warfare conflict has to. And yes, the tradition, the just war tradition is malleable enough. And by the way, earlier I failed to make the distinction between justified war as opposed to just war. I just want to go on record as saying there never has been anything that any war or conflict that's been perfectly just. That's almost a misnomer. So it's better to speak of a tradition of justified war as opposed to just war. So I want to lay that on the table. But back to terrorism and non-conventional means. Yes, the tradition is supple, malleable, and abiding enough to apply to non-conventional means of conflict. And I would include not only terrorism, piracy, but I would also include humanitarian intervention in that whole complex of non-conventional phenomena. Look, most people, with the end of the Cold War, I remember well, I was just getting out of grad school, and there was, I don't want to say euphoria, but there was this sort of misguided optimism that the world somehow was now entering this new era of peace. John, if anything, the end of the Cold War brought about more non-conventional crises, what humanitarian scholars call humanitarian emergencies. There have been, the number escapes me when I read the literature, but there has been an endless number of these emergency international crises since the end of the Cold War. I mean, that could entail anything from, say, ethnic tribal conflict, such as what the world experienced in 1994 as the Rwandan crisis broke, which, by the way, remains, in my view, an eternal scar on the conscience of the West. We did nothing. We had evidence that a boil was going to burst. There was a history there, but the Western nations did nothing. And in a span of, I think it was 100 days, 3.5 months, 100 days, anywhere between 750,000 to 1.25 million people, again in the span of 100 days, were macheted or clubbed to death. And basically, nations did nothing. That is inexcusable. So when we speak of the golden rule, when we speak of right intention, when we speak of defending the defenseless, it seems to me nations have an obligation in coalition, wherever possible, absolutely, in coalition to resist evil and protect people. So ethnic tribal conflict, collapse or failed states, gee, how many of them have we had in the last 30 years? How about widespread health or food shortages, displaced peoples? How much has that happened in the last 30 years? So the non-traditional, the non-conventional military intervention, what many call humanitarian intervention, in addition to piracy and terrorism, are ever before us. And so in answer to your question, yes, the principles of the justified war tradition are there, and if we apply them, Now, we have to do the applying. That's the hard work. And the tradition doesn't work like a cookie cutter. We can't just put it down on every crisis and it'll lead to the same results. We have to discern what is appropriate, what is wise here, what is just, what's not just. So sometimes the wisdom of the tradition will counsel against intervening. Sometimes the wisdom of the tradition will counsel for intervening. We have to discern that, and that's hard work. There's no shortcut around that. And complicating matters today, John, is a sort of non-intervention attitude, isn't it? You know, we're so worried. We're so tired. I mean, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan and that part of the world for the last 16 years now. But hey, what we've learned in those last 16 years is another aspect that just war scholars would call jus post bellum, that is justice after war. And that is part of the whole tradition. That is to say, the same justice that leads us to consider intervening, that same justice that calls us to account how we execute, that very same justice then asks us, what are our obligations post-conflict, right? After. And I would say that requires elements of nation building and national reconstruction. And if people argue, well, Daryl, that is pie in the sky, or that's unrealistic, or who can do that, I would simply point to Germany as an example of why that was necessary. The German nation was destitute after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles penalized them severely. And in the 1920s, the end of World War I, Germany was a mess. And Germany was rife for what coagulated then in the 30s and erupted in another war in the 1940s. But look at what happened after World War II. And that this is not a plug for the perfection of the Marshall Plan, and we did everything right, and what the United Nations have done was pristine. But the coalition of nations of the world post-World War II eradicated not Germany, but Nazism, and elevated, helped rebuild Germany so that today she is the pride and jewel of Europe. And we, the community of nations, are the better because of that. So I would point to post-World War II German Reconstruction, not only as our obligation back then, but as a model of why that's just and moral, and how beautiful that can be even in an imperfect world.
You know, the more these questions come up and the more complicated it seems, the more I really resonate with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's line that he wrote to his former seminary students, which he would do even after the seminary was shut down, even some of his students who were now in the German military. But his line was, something along the lines is not in the flight of ideas, but only in action is freedom. Make up your mind and come out into the tempest of the living. And I think, Daryl, there's it's a powerful line, isn't it? There's an incarnational aspect here to these ethical questions, even these extremely difficult ones, that it's easier to safely fly away into a world of ideals where you don't actually have to apply it. But the world we live in is the real world, and that's the world that Jesus took on flesh. And there's an incarnational aspect of our ethical pondering, isn't there?
Well said. Well said. Hey, and with that, I want to look to Jesus' example, and in fact, the apostolic example, and even John the Baptist. It's interesting that when, in a time, in a moment, in a cultural mood of repentance, soldiers come to John the Baptist, right? Only Luke records this in Luke 3. They come to him, like other groups, other individuals, asking, what do we need to do? And it's interesting to me that in a context of repentance, the Baptists did not respond, you need to get out of the foreign legions, keep your hands clean, repent of your professional soldiering, and become spiritually minded. What did he do? He told them two things. Look, don't mistreat people. Be content with your wages. Wow. Don't act unjustly, and be content with the material. And then Jesus, what does he do? And I think this is recorded in Matthew 8. He says, this example I've not seen anywhere in Israel, this example of faith. Guess who the object is there? It's a Roman centurion.
Yeah.
Wow. In all of Israel, I've not found faith such as this. And of course, he was looking to the Lord concerning a family need. And then it's interesting to me that, guess what? A Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius, Acts 10 and 11, is chosen by God. Why? Who knows? Chosen by God to help mediate a fuller understanding of divine revelation to the Apostle Peter. And then he ends up becoming the very first Gentile to be baptized. Wow. So neither the Baptist, nor Jesus, nor the apostles, in any context of which we're aware, are calling soldiers away from the service of the state. The argument is not that the state is perfect or the state should be absolute. No. It's simply that every realm has its limited autonomy, and if all Christians flee, not just the culture in general, but if all Christians flee civil service, governmental service, military service, service to the state, that's a recipe, it seems to me, for evacuation and disaster. And here again, I'm rooting my theology, though, not just in the New Testament, but in a theology of creation, right? That is to say, because of our creation image of God and because culture is something that's good and right of itself and not evil in and of itself. Can it be tarnished? Yes. Is it fallen? Yes. But can it be restored? Yes. And does it, in a sense, reflect God's glory? Yes. So we don't want to call people out of positions of service, whether they're military, civil, or private, but rather we want to encourage faithfulness. And it seems to me that's what the Baptist does, that's what Jesus does, that's what the apostles do, even in a fallen world. So I think our theology, we tend to read Scripture selectively, and very often the pacifist position, it pitches a tent in a certain reading of the Sermon on the Mount, but neglects to factor in the wider parameter of biblical revelation. And if we do that, I think we miss out then on the full and robust theology of culture and cultural participation.
Well, my guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast has been Dr. Daryl Charles. He is the Acton Institute affiliated scholar in theology and ethics and the author of several books, and those that are most relevant to our conversation today: The Just War Tradition, co-authored with Daryl and David Corey, and America and the Just War Tradition, which you co-authored with Mark David Hall, who I just had on the podcast a few weeks ago on his book about America's founding. Yeah, he's a brilliant scholar. Daryl, it's good to talk to you. It's been a long time since we've caught up, and it's great to catch up over this, and just grateful for your work and your commitment to clarity in dealing with some really controversial and difficult things, but I think you shed a lot of light on the topic today, and so we're grateful for that. Thanks for being a part of the BreakPoint Podcast.
Oh, well, thank you, John. You're very kind. Hey, let's do it again.
Let's do it.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Again, to get your subscription to World Magazine with your next gift to BreakPoint and the Colson Center, go to breakpoint.org/January. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.